Hi, my name is Joan Burton, and you're listening to In Conversation With.
We're good to go. So we'll just intro it like we normally do anyways. Intro our show. So hello and welcome back to In Conversation With myself, Colin, and my lovely co-host Greg.
How you doing?
And Gavin.
How you doing?
We are coming to you, not live of course, but we are coming to you from Leinster House today.
I thought we were going to do a big reveal.
Oh, were we?
Yeah, well, it's a bit late now.
Probably one of our most high-profile interviews so far.
Without putting too much pressure on her right here in front of us.
I'd have to say, the setting we're in, given we usually record in like a boardroom or a classroom in DCU.
Occasionally the studio.
Occasionally the studio. We're coming to you from Leinster House today, and today we're joined by former Tánaiste and Labour TD Joan Burton. Joan, very welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, and it's great to meet you at last after, how many efforts did we make to meet?
A couple, alright.
Quite a few.
There was...
We were holding out to get to Leinster House, you know.
Yeah, we really wanted that invitation.
So it was a subterfuge. Okay, it's a great to start an interview. But you're very welcome here to
thanks very much.
My humble abode.
Yeah, we were a bit like...
Purposes.
It was a bit like the first time we walked through the halls of RT, a bit starstruck or just a bit in awe walking down the halls.
Yeah, you're about a half an hour late, but given my previous history as having been a lecturer in GIT and lecturing journalism students among others, I am kind of used to the notion that occasionally life intervenes and students can be a bit late.
I was waiting on you lads.
Yes.
In fairness to
I was
Gavin,
here at
9:30. He waited outside.
But we got our bus and traffic was awful coming through Drumcondra.
Yeah, that's life.
Yeah, exactly.
That's Dublin.
Right, sure. We'll get underway. So we'll start from the very beginning, I suppose. So, where did the interest in politics first stem from?
Well, I suppose I've always been interested in current affairs. Even as a child, I kind of listened in, and my family just always discussed. They weren't political in any formal political sense, political parties or anything like that. But current affairs, politics, events, just always were discussed in our house, and people read newspapers, Sunday papers, and papers like the Evening Herald, and so I suppose I've just always been interested in current affairs.
Very good. And what was your first experiences entering the world of politics?
Well, I went to school in Stanhope Street in Stony Batter, which when I was living there was actually a very strong working class community. Now it's possibly one of the hippest places that you could live in Ireland, I understand, and there are application lists by people to go and live there. But when I lived there, it was just a very strong working class community where people worked. I went to school in Stanhope Street, which was the Sisters of Charity Convent School. I was on my third primary school by the time I got there, around first class, so I have to say I was delighted I got on there, and in fact so much so that I stayed there for my secondary education. And I would have been, I suppose, one of the first people who went to university on scholarship, as it was in those days, and had all the explorations of going over to UCD, quitting a job that I had taken up as soon as I finished my leaving, and then doing initially both English and business, and from that then I went on to work as a chartered accountant, qualified as a chartered accountant, and work for one of the big accounting firms.
What was the job that you quit to go to UCD?
Well, I was a bit of an expert at jobs, so I worked in a lot of different stores and bars, but as soon as my leaving was over, I got a temporary job in the civil service in the GPO, and happily I quit it in around the middle of September. In those days, the scholarships for girls were given out after the scholarships for boys. Okay. So I was slightly late in arriving in UCD, and I was just going to do English or history, English and history, but English in particular. But I met the porter there. He had a look at my scholarship and everything like that. Famous man, Mr. Keogh. And he said, no, you need to do something practical that you'll get a job as well. So I combined English and business studies. Commerce had become.
Yeah, we hear that a lot, like, with our own degree of communications, like, are we really going to get a job out of this, the practicality of it?
Yeah, there's a lot of jokes been made about our specific course, communications in DCU, for its low employment rate afterwards.
Yeah, but we interviewed Rachel English there last week, and she's a graduate of communications herself. So
so there's hope for us yet. What were some of your fondest memories from UCD then, studying and otherwise?
Well, I just met some lovely people who are still friends of mine. I'm happy to say. Personally, in my life, it was a bit of a struggle because really I just needed money, which is why I am.
We can relate to that,
alright. Focused on people being able to get jobs and make a bit of money of their own. It was a difficult time in my life because it coincided with a period when my mother was very ill, and by the time I was in second year, unfortunately, she died. So that just took up a lot of my time, and I had a younger brother. But, again, as a family, we talked, and we weren't well off, but I'd say it was a nice way to grow up. It's always difficult, I think, for anybody who loses a parent when, or a parent gets sick when they're a teenager or when they're very young. It's just a particular experience. It makes you grow up very fast.
I'd say so.
It develops your sense of responsibility, which can actually be a useful thing in a politician. Maybe desirable as well.
I'd say so. And when was the first inclination you had that, a career in politics might be a possibility?
Well, I never thought of politics as career, and my advice to all aspiring politicians might be to think of it as a vocation. Because to be honest, unless, for instance, you came maybe from a very political background where you knew a lot about politics, there isn't really a book that you can take down and read about how to become a politician, thankfully, because that could be an awful book, actually.
A dangerous book.
That could be a very dangerous book. So when I was in school, I suppose one of the influences on me in school was Sister Stanislaus Kennedy. Lived in the convent attached to the school, and she worked with the people who had gone on to secondary school in the school, which was a fairly small select group, because in those days a lot of women in particular finished their education after junior cert level around 16, but the nuns then were really really anxious to expand into Leaving Cert, so I got an opportunity to do Leaving Cert. And she would have got us as fifth year and sixth years very involved in the kind of stuff that she runs nowadays, which I suppose is about getting young people to think about the world around them and to think about how things might be improved. She wasn't overtly political at all, but it did coincide, and it's amazing how history goes in cycles, with the period when housing in Dublin was in a terrible state, because literally the slum houses from the end of the 19th century, they were literally falling down, and so there was a rush then to build a lot of new estates, some of which were successful, some of which were not. So in a certain sense it has echoes of the current period. The other thing, I suppose, worldwide that was expanding was the idea of education as an opportunity that should just be, an opportunity that everybody had a chance to avail of, not just people whose parents could afford it. So I suppose those two things, education, housing, the idea of opportunity, were what stimulated me. I would not have thought of myself as a politician in the making at all. I would have thought of myself and was somebody very interested in politics and political ideas. and in fact there was a long road to go before I actually became a candidate in terms of becoming active in politics in that sense. I joined the local Labour Party branch in Oxford Town Road, O'Debney Gardens, when I was in my early 20s. So I wasn't really involved in student politics because I was simply just very absorbed in what was happening in my own personal life in terms of my mum being sick and so on.
And obviously for those who know you, and probably those who don't know, that you're obviously a Labour TD, what was it that attracted you to Labour specifically?
Issues like education and the Labour Party's approach of having a society of decency and fairness. In particular, I went to a meeting about education and I met a then Labour Party TD called David Thornley, and he just invited me to join the Labour Party. That's really important actually, that people are invited by somebody to join a political party, because often people who have no political background, it's not something that they're familiar with or aware of. And when I joined the Labour Party then, I met people like Noel Brown, who was a very famous person in the politics of the 40s, 50s and 60s, and who was then, if you like, a veteran politician. And again, he had really clear ideas around things like health and the idea in Ireland, which we're still debating, of building effectively a national health service in Ireland. And he had famously fallen out with the clergy in Ireland around the issue of having, revolutionary for those days, a free mother and child health scheme. In other words, mothers and their children who needed health care, particularly in terms of pregnancy and in terms of children, that would be supplied free. There was an almighty row between the church and the state and Dr. Brown on the issue, and he was Minister for Health at the time. He was amazingly famous for those days, because when he became Minister for Health, as a young Minister for Health, besides having a red sports car, which I heard about, he was the person who really organised the health service to end TB in Ireland. And from the 30s up to the 40s, when Ireland was very poor, and into the early 50s, there were an awful lot of people who had TB. It was a major killer and scourge of Ireland, say in the way that AIDS became in the gay community in the 1980s. And essentially he organised sanatoriums, treatments, the development of different antibiotics where people could be treated. So in fact, for a lot of people in Dublin, he was a bit of a folk hero. And as a consequence, his proposals around having a mother and baby scheme, health scheme, would have chimed very strongly with what people were aware of was happening in the UK, with people like Aaron Bevan setting up the National Health Service after the war.
Very good.
So Joan, when you first ran in Mulhuddart in 1991, what was the original campaigning process like? It was something you're pretty unfamiliar with.
Well, before I ran in Mulhuddart, I actually did indicate an interest in running in Dublin Central, and this is a key lesson for all aspiring politicians. But everybody having said to me, "Oh, you should run," because, being from the area and so on, as soon as I put my hand up and said, "Okay, I'll run," everybody said, "Oh yeah, we want new people, but we don't particularly want you." So sorry, this is like, it's a bit like reality TV. You really have to put your head above the parapet. You don't necessarily have, what was it, all those people who ran in the presidential election, a Dragon's Den person saying to you, you're in or you're out. But people have a way of, let's say, expressing that. And in fact, I did run in the general election at the end of the 1980s in Dublin Central, and people in Dublin West in the Labour Party asked me would I run there, and I met them and I said, "You want me?" Of course I'll run. No, I was very happy to run. By then I had a lot of experience. I was probably older than most people coming new to politics. I had lived abroad in Africa for 3 years in the early 80s, and in fact I would say the catalyst for my actually going from being a political activist, interested in policy and stuff like that in the Labour Party, to saying I might run, really arose in Africa, because just life, even today in Africa, is on a different dimension for a lot of people to what people experience in Ireland. And also in Africa, you can really see the impact then and now of climate change and what it does to communities. You can also see how wars get started over resources. And I lived in a country called Tanzania on the east coast of Africa. So having come home in the middle of the 1980s, from then on, basically my involvement in politics stepped up quite a lot. At that stage, I was working as a senior lecturer in the DIT, in what is now Ainger Street, and currently changing over to Grange Gorman. So in fact, again, working with students is it's always very interesting because you're seeing how young people see their society and what they think they want to make of it.
Yeah. And you were working as a lecturer in Tanzania.
Go on, try it.
Well, Greg, I don't know if it's just a bit too early for him, but he had trouble pronouncing the name of the university over there. Dar es Salaam?
Dar es Salaam, the port of peace.
Did you do the Google thing where she talks to you?
No, I'm just able to read English.
Fine, whatever. Anyways, Joan, while you were there, you actually went with the international aid program at the time, and then later, I think it was about 95, you actually became the Minister for Overseas Aid.
Yeah.
So how did that time in Africa really prepare you for your role?
I'm the only member, I think, of an Irish government who still speaks a little Kiswahili.
Oh, wow.
Just a little. How did that go? It was a very strange experience because I went with an organisation called APSO, the Agency for Personal Services Overseas, which basically facilitated people in areas like education and broadly in the public service, that if there was an Irish aid programme that was being assisted either in a country or in a specific field, you might go there and work on it, and you could get leave of absence, which is what myself and my husband Pat Carroll did. Pat in terms of maths, myself in terms of business education, and looking at the development of business education in southern and eastern Africa. So that was a very interesting experience, and I had a chance as well to teach courses for managers in northern Tanzania a couple of times a year, up close to the Serengeti in a place called Arusha. And that's what I'm saying about being able to see, how climate change and that is affecting the planet. When I came back to Ireland, then I really did then start committing to politics. Also, before I left for Africa and after I came back, we had an unsuccessful campaign to permit divorce in Ireland. And secondly, in '83, there was the 8th Amendment, and my husband was one of the few people in politics who was actually, if you like, a patron of the anti-amendment. Say no to this amendment. It is not going to be good for women. It's not going to be good for babies. So, in fact, by the time I came back to Ireland, I think women's issues were also coming to the fore. And in 1990, Mary Robinson ran for president. I was very active in her campaign, particularly in Dublin West. And I suppose in a way that campaign became the nucleus of my own campaign. And not just me, there were a lot of women attracted to supporting Mary Robinson, many of whom were in the Labour Party and who, like myself, were at a point where if people did ask them to run for election, they ran. There was, people like Roisin Shortall and others who ran at that point for politics, as I did myself. the Mulhuddard election in 2011 was a tight three-seater. Myself and Joe Higgins were elected in it, so there was a bit of a shift to the left in Dublin West. And then roll on to 92 and the election at the end, November of 92, I became a Teachta Dála and was elected to the Dáil along with a number of women for the Labour Party. There was a bit of a breakthrough by women across the parties in that election. And I found myself in Dick Spring's office being invited to become a Minister of State pretty much on my first day in the
Department of Social
the Department of Social Protection, where I was involved in community development, which has always been a really strong interest of mine. And you know, I had a lot of experience around community development, both here and in different parts of Africa. I should say as well, the first office, or that I held in a formal way, was I was the secretary of the anti-apartheid movement in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, and that was partly what stimulated going to live in Africa and see what it was like.
Would you go back?
Oh yeah, I went back for a private visit a year ago.
Very good. And
it's fascinating. And again, I mean...
Has it changed much since you're...
Yes, it has discovered oil and gas. So in fact, like in a lot of African countries, there's an incredibly well-off set of people. Now huge amounts of the third level system are privatised, whereas when I was there, basically almost all of education was state-led. There are now huge numbers. That's again another feature of a lot of African countries. And there's just enormous wealth among a very select few of people. There's a growing middle class, but there's also a huge number of people who are very, very poor. And the Irish Aid Programme, which is concentrated on issues like women and children and education, I think it does make a very positive contribution. And I do think country-to-country aid is important because it's a way for people learning a little bit more maybe about, people from our partner countries learning about Ireland and we learning about the partner countries.
Mm-hmm. Like we've mentioned a couple of the positions you've held since being elected TD. Is there anyone you feel you've particularly thrived in over the others?
Well, I suppose there's a number of different ways of looking at people's, achievement in politics. In terms of legislation, because I have always been somebody who has been progressive in terms of social movements and very supportive of them, whether that's been to do with women or that's been to do with people who are gay or people seeking asylum in Ireland. So looking at my record in terms of legislation, obviously I've been heavily involved in social welfare bills and budgets, but I was also, as a minister, the person who brought in the first Refugee Act in Ireland, which was in 96-97, and which set up an appeal system. And while that has been vastly changed by ministers who came afterwards, the principles of it, of people having a hearing, of expanding the basis on which people could seek asylum from being the Geneva Convention basis to expand to include issues like gender, membership of a trade union. That was very progressive for Ireland at the time. So there were long conversations with the Department of Justice about that. But eventually the Dáil and the Seanad agreed to it. In the most recent government, I would have been involved with bringing through social protection two pieces of legislation which hopefully have had positive effects on people's lives. One was to allow people like humanists to solemnise marriages, and the other included in that legislation was to allow weddings to be celebrated in places other than just simply a registry office or a church. So every time I go to a wedding, I think about if the wedding's in a hotel, very often with a solemnizer who's a spiritualist or a humanist, rather than a traditional church-based wedding service. You know, I just think of that legislation took a while, but in fact once, and this I think is the thing about social progress, sometimes people are nervous and apprehensive about changes, and then they find, you know, if the changes come into legislation, people absorb it. Society, if you like, changes to absorb the change, and it moves on. And the other one, which for me was certainly in education, it wasn't something I knew a great deal about, was piloting transgender legislation through the Dáil. That was a long conversation with different members, with people right across the different parties, people like Angus O'Snuddick from Sinn Féin, and people from Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the people who were sitting around the cabinet table with me when I was bringing it in and explaining it. And one quite questioning person at the time was a fellow minister from Dublin West, Leo Varadkar, who put a lot of tough questions on the legislation to me. But that's part of, you know, getting legislation. And in terms of looking at what have I done in politics, I think there are three important things that have been important in Irish society. I was also heavily involved in the discussions in the Labour Party to promote free access for tuition to third level education in Ireland, which I think is really important that people can do that. And obviously in social welfare, I would have come in at a time when over 300,000 people had lost their jobs. It was the highest level of unemployment in Ireland since the early 50s. So it was a personal disaster for a lot of people with businesses, small businesses, they lost the businesses. So I worked with a very good team of people in the Department of Social Protection to try and change that around. And I think we changed a lot of it around. And again, if you look today, the numbers of people who are unemployed is way down. However, there are a lot of different parts and areas of the country where unemployment is still high, and unemployment among younger people is still much higher than I'd like to see it.
Funnily enough, actually, on your first bit of legislation that you spoke of, I work in a hotel at the weekends, and certainly from our aspect, I'd say business is definitely on the up because of it. We've so many civil ceremonies in the hotel now and stuff, which we didn't when I would have first even started in the hotel.
Is that my first accolade from the hotel industry?
It could be. I will get a little plaque made.
Greg is a spokesperson for the hotel industry, so
unnamed hotel.
But yeah, and obviously you've done a lot of great work, passing a lot of legislation, and that's been recognised and was recognised within your own party. You rose to the position of deputy leader in 2007, and of course leader in 2014. How does it feel when word comes down that you're going to become deputy and then leader of the party you joined?
How much longer before it was announced did you actually know? How long did you have to sit on it and say,
because it was membership votes. In fact, I suppose in a way I'm rather unique in the history of the Labour Party, in that I was elected by the membership both to be deputy leader and subsequently to be leader. I wasn't anointed or appointed. That's
it wasn't gifted to you. No?
That's trickier usually, you know, for women. I think we're more used to male popes than female. So in fact, I've had the unique privilege, but also I think it's really important. If people are elected, you've had an opportunity to meet your electorate, talk to the electorate, hear what they're interested in and so on. And I do think that's a strength. You know, somebody who has a kind of very clean run, to be honest, in terms of practicing politicians, that's an enormous relief. But on the other hand, being contested and having people question you and listening to people, I think that's also very important. So elections have an important purpose in terms of trying to clarify priorities and issues, because you don't have the money to do everything, or you don't have the capacity to do everything. So you have to try and pick what's important. And in fact, I've always had, if you like, a policy personally, whether I've been involved in the council and I've been elected to the County Council on 2 different occasions, the old Dublin County Council and Fingal County Council, and I've been elected to the Dáil 5 times. I just find literally every week, certainly at a minimum every month, you need to ask yourself, what am I doing? What am I going to do next? And what do I want to do? Because I think in politics, probably to a degree like journalism and so on, you have to imagine and think about what you want to report. While news happens and politics happen, if you're a practitioner in the area, you have to decide, what am I doing, what are my interests? And I think that's very important, because people who are TDs and senators, while you may be part of a bigger party structure and the party will have lots of collective policies and programs, you also really have to keep questioning yourself as to what's the most important thing now, and how can I do something about it? What should I do about it? What kind of an intervention should I make?
And I was just going to ask there, actually, particularly within a party election, if, say, a number of candidates are running for leader, you're obviously opposing each other, but then once somebody's elected, you're all back together again. Is it difficult going from opposing somebody to, as you're running for leader, and then going straight back to working with them in the party?
Well, I think it was Churchill who said something like, your opposition is across the chamber, but your enemies are behind your back in your own party. So let's say there's a lot of healthy and sometimes unhealthy rivalry in political parties, and you do need to be tough. You do need not necessarily to take it all personally, or hope that it's not all personal, and that people are just having a moment that will pass. And I think also nowadays more people have that experience because of social media, where there's, if you like, a line between someone, having a go at you or criticising you, to, trolling and just basically setting out to destruct you as a person. So in politics, there's a lot of passion because the stakes can be very high, and I think you have to be resilient, and that's why I think thinking fairly constantly about what you're doing, what you want to do, is really important. Because if you have a sense of purpose in what you're doing, a sense of meaning in terms of what you're doing, in terms of representing constituents. I'll give you an example. Currently the problem with the schools, in terms of the schools up in Tyrrellstown being found to have defects, I find that heartbreaking, because Dublin West is a very new area. One of its great successes is having a fantastic collection of schools and teachers in schools, and now suddenly these quite expensive school buildings, which were apparently built using all the regulations that were appropriate and so on, turn out to have major defects. So that's a huge shock. So you really have to think, how are we going to sort this, and how are we going to get the education of the children back on track, get the teachers back doing what they want to do, which is to educate children. So stuff like that happens in politics. I mean, it was Macmillan who said, I seem to be quoting 2 British Prime Ministers in a row, who said, events, dear boy, events. And that's what happens in politics. It's a dull day, and by 5 o'clock something may have happened. I think that's possibly, I should ask you, part of the interest of journalism. That it's the march of ideas and stories.
Every day is
and
different.
Every day is different.
Exactly. No 2 guests we've had have been the same anyways, that's for sure. And obviously you came to be Labour leader in 2014. The country was still in a bit of disarray at that time. How did you feel coming into the position? And
obviously you were the first female leader of the Labour Party as well.
Yeah. And I felt very honoured by that. I also felt that it was going to be enormously difficult, because when Eamon Gilmore stood down, the Labour Party had just suffered a really difficult local election. I had gone out extensively canvassing and meeting and working with candidates in that local election, and I was very aware of how low morale was. Essentially, from a political point of view, the Labour Party had a lot of enemies in terms of being involved in government. A decision that we made with our eyes wide open, and I was part of that decision. And part of my decision was influenced by my experience of living abroad and my experience of how global finance works in terms of the big organisations. I had been in countries where they had defaulted and told the international institutions, as people were suggesting at the time, tell them to take a walk. And the consequence of that was decades of really enormous difficulties for countries. So I did not believe in the blanket bank guarantee. I thought it was wrong. I thought Anglo should have been wound down as soon as possible. And I was aware for about a year as finance spokesperson that things were potentially going to be very difficult for Ireland. I underestimated how difficult, but I was aware that in all the hoopla over the Celtic Tiger that there were deep flaws in how finances were structured. So it was a very difficult period. Coming into the leadership, I was both exhilarated and, if you like, daunted by the sheer level of work that the Labour Party would have to do to rebuild itself. I think ultimately, in historical terms, people will accept that the Labour Party made the correct decision, which was, as it were, to save the country rather than just save the Labour Party. And so I think the Labour Party at the moment is on a slow rebuild, and hopefully that will bear fruit at the next local elections, general elections. A lot of young people now joining the Labour Party again, and some very interesting conversations going on about how people see Ireland in the future.
Mm-hmm. And you were leader until 2016. Was it a difficult decision to step down?
Yes, it was, and it was in the context that a lot of very good people from the Labour Party lost their seats, but it was also in the context that, Fine Gael is a centre-right party. It's an extremely well organised party, but there would be a lot of political differences between, say, the Labour Party, my politics, and the politics of a lot of people in Fine Gael. But because the country was in such an extreme state of financial collapse at the time, we felt it was necessary and appropriate to do the deal. When the election was over, I didn't think that it was appropriate for Labour to go into government. I didn't think we had a mandate to do that. And I decided as well that it would be better to have a new leader. So I offered my resignation, and that was accepted. But Labour remains very much part of me, and I will certainly do everything I can to help to rebuild the party.
Very good.
And as a political leader, Joan, what do you think are the most important qualities for that job?
I think an ability to try and identify where the best interest of people lies, to try and identify where you can get agreement to progress that, because ideas, unless you can translate them into a workable programme, they're interesting, but they're not necessarily going to impact on people's lives. So I think you have to try and identify a pathway. And for instance, in social protection, a pathway to helping people get jobs, of bringing employers, for instance, who'd no connection with the Department of Social Welfare, believe it or not, to get them to come in and to have a sense, look, we have these incredibly talented people in Ireland at the moment because of financial crash, which they didn't cause. A lot of those people are sitting at home looking at four walls. and just trying to get the spirit of the country going again. I think as well, the other quality that's required is honesty, so that you tell people what's possible and what's not possible. And of course, I'm sure as students you've read your Machiavelli, and that certainly comes into politics in a big way. I think as well, because there are so few women in Irish politics, the experience often of women, like the experience of, say, perhaps people from either a particular background or with a particular life history, making your way is basically a challenge, sometimes difficult, but it also makes you, and then you bring something new and you bring your experience, and certainly that's the exciting and the fulfilling part of it.
Unfortunately, we are running a bit short on time, so we're going to end with a lighter segment. We've had a great chat about your career, so we're going to end off on something a little bit lighter. So we'll just do a bit of our get to know you questions. I've
been thinking about this since we walked in. Is it tea or coffee?
It's tea, and it's black tea.
Black tea, okay.
Do you leave the tea bag in, or do you take it out?
Absolutely out. I drink extremely light tea, but I'm a bit of a tea addict, so I drink a lot of it.
No coffee, no?
Never, no.
How many cups of tea a day do you think?
I would say 10 to 15 minimum.
Ooh, wow.
That is
light,
a tea addict.
Light.
Yeah, okay.
Any sugar?
No.
Just black?
No additives at all.
Okay.
Pure stuff, yeah. 3 guests, alive or dead, to invite to a dinner party.
Okay, let me see. I think I'd invite Jim Larkin, because I'm looking at his poster there on the wall, poster by Bobby Balla. He's jumping out a window, or he's climbing out a window. And I think I would also like one of the women painters in early 20th century Ireland, like maybe Mary Swansea, who really made breakthroughs but are barely recognised in Ireland. Another woman is Eileen Gray. She's really famous in France for design and furniture. We barely know about her in Ireland. So I'd like some woman like that if you can arrange.
Okay.
And
we'll reach out.
You get on the emails.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I think as well, in terms of current people, I think I'd invite Michael D.
Very good
and
one.
of course the dogs.
The dogs, they're a key
I am
feature.
a dog lover.
Yes.
Do you have any dogs yourself?
I do. Well, no, I have a part share in a dog. My daughter has a dog, so occasionally I mind the dog.
Good.
We mind, Pat and I mind the dog.
Yeah. What kind of dog is it?
It's called a cabochon. It's one of those new breeds of dogs.
Okay.
Which doesn't shed, which is brilliant for me.
Yeah.
And which is a cross between.
I'd say like.
Yeah, it's a
bit of a Bichon
Frise and Spaniel, long ears, some kind.
Very good.
Now, all your experts are going to tell me I'm wrong.
And Joan, the best advice you've ever been given, or you could pass on to anyone?
I think it was Mr. Keogh saying you'll need a job. Long time ago in UCD.
Very good. That's good. Nice and succinct. Yeah, I like that. Listen, Joan, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for inviting us out here to Leinster House. I'm glad we finally got to sit down with you after the ordeal we went through to try and organise it.
Well, I'm going to offer you a cup of coffee or tea in the Dála bar now.
Wow.
Oh, I feel privileged. Thank you very much. It's been a great interview, Joan. Thanks again for inviting us. Yeah, this has been In Conversation with Joan Burton, with myself, Colin, and my co-hosts, Gavin and Greg. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you again very soon.
It's very Christmassy. Ho-hosts. You're getting in the mood.